Oh, we are right here. We are just running a little late, little technical stuff. Good morning. I'm Babs Rose-Ivy. And if you just tuned in around 9 o'clock, you've got me, Love Babs, Love Talk. So today I've got Earl Bloodworth and Mr. Barone. What's the first name?
Ken.
Hey, Ken Barone.
Hi.
And
Hey,
y'all
good
are
morning.
from?
I'm from New Haven, but
I know you're from New Haven.
I'm currently the new director at the Mayor's Initiative for Reentry Affairs in the city of Bridgeport.
Oh, okay.
And I manage the state of Connecticut's racial profiling prohibition project, and I work out of Central Connecticut State University.
Really?
Yeah.
Do you know Andrew?
He's
Yeah.
my supervisor.
Oh,
Yeah.
We both do.
Tell him I said
Yeah.
hello.
I
I
will.
love him.
Great.
We were at dinner. I met him at a dinner party a few years ago,
Mhm.
and we've been friends. We've he's brought his kids to stuff, and I've given him tickets to
Yeah.
stuff. So tell him I said hello and
I
happy
will.
My
New
tickets,
Year.
I will.
Tickets.
You listen. Y'all get around. You get around more than I do.
Oh man.
So y'all are here today to talk about. Let me see. Let me pull this up. So you got an event coming up,
Correct.
and you want some traction on that.
A little bit.
All right. So tell me a little bit about it. Let me pull it up. Thank you for sending this to me.
Not a problem.
If I can get it up.
Well, I'll just be brief.
Okay.
Ken is a lot more involved than I am or used to be. Ken and I met in 2015.
Mm-hmm.
I was working up at the General Assembly for the African American Affairs Commission.
Oh, I remember that commission.
Yeah, I do too, fondly. And they were originally responsible for handling the immense amount of data that was supposed to be coming in.
You know, you can put your headsets on if you
Oh
want.
yeah, I can do that. Huh? So yeah, the commission was responsible for the immense amount of data that was supposed to be coming in from all police stops throughout the entire state based on the Alvin Penn law, but the law had not really had any teeth and it wasn't really staffed well. And then in 2014, 2015, they added the legislature added some more teeth to the bill.
Okay.
And gave it some proper resources, which I guess it landed over in IMRP at the Central Connecticut State
What is
University.
IMRP?
So it's a nonpartisan policy institute. It stands for the Institute for Municipal and Regional Policy, and we've primarily focused on criminal justice-related issues for the state of Connecticut for the last 15 plus years. And back in 2011, we got a call from, at the time, Mike Lawler, who was working in the governor's office, because there had been a number of police officers arrested right next to New Haven and East Haven for violating the civil rights of
jacking up
Latinos.
immigrants, and I know East Haven, all these other kinds. I know.
And so the state was trying to figure out, what do we do about this? You know, we have a law in the books that's supposed to prevent this stuff from happening, and why did it take the FBI to come in and arrest a handful of officers to bring attention to this issue? So,
because we didn't want to jam cops up.
we really just had our head in the sand.
Yeah.
And we had a law in the books, but it was sort of
Toothless.
and it was never funded, and it was.
I love those unfunded mandates.
And so we spent about 18 months working with we put together a state advisory board, which is made up of advocates, different state agencies, law enforcement. We came together and said, okay, what can we do here to try and eliminate racial profiling in Connecticut? And the law took effect in 2013. We got the legislature to rewrite the Alvin Penn Act. The Alvin Penn Act is named for the former state senator Alvin Penn from Bridgeport, who was one of the original champions of the original legislation back in the late 1990s. And upon his death, the state named the legislation after him. And so we've been working to we are mandated to evaluate every single police department in the state of Connecticut once a year. There's 107 police departments.
Ooh.
And
are they happy to see you?
Usually not.
I didn't think so.
No. And so we are required to evaluate every department, and we've built a system in Connecticut. Although can be a little wonky and a little academic, it's a system that's been replicated now in 4 other states. Rhode Island, Oregon, and California have all modeled their way in which they provide oversight in this area of policing after Connecticut. And we have to date in Connecticut identified 32 police departments out of the 107 with significant, what we term significant racial disparities.
Were you surprised by that? Would you think it would be higher or less?
I didn't know what to expect when we started this. I think what has surprised me since in doing this research over the last 6 years is I had maybe a preconceived notion that the areas and the departments where we would see the most significant disparities would be our major cities.
Mm-hmm.
We'd see the biggest problems in New Haven and Bridgeport and Hartford, New Britain and Stamford.
Right.
And what we have consistently seen is that it is the predominantly white suburban towns
The border
that
towns.
border our major
I
urban
know.
centers that have the bigger problem.
Yeah.
And so our focus over the last 6 years, the vast majority of those 30 plus departments that we've identified and gone in to investigate have been the border towns, and it's brought up. We've provided, I think, data and context and meat to anecdotal stories that we've heard for the last 30 plus years.
So when you go and do these investigations, or
It's not necessarily an investigation.
not investigation, but
because data is collected
when you
throughout
go and
every
collect
stop.
this data,
Right.
do you go back to them and say, this is what we found, and
Mhm.
do you make recommendations or suggestions of what you should do, or do you refer them to somebody who can help them correct
Yeah.
whatever the issue is?
So the system we have in Connecticut is every single police department gets evaluated initially using 7 different measures. And, the reason why we do it that way is because 15, 20 years ago, when this type of research was being done in Connecticut and elsewhere, typically researchers would come in and they would look at who was stopped and they would compare that to some census benchmark. So they would say, okay, 10% of the drivers stopped in town A were black, and 5% of the population in town A was black, and so there must be a problem. And what would happen is the community would be upset by that, and they would say, see, we have a problem and we need reform in policing. And police would come out and they would say, well, no, you didn't account for these 10 other things. And so the analysis and the data was no good. And ultimately what that approach did was it just created more tension between law enforcement and the community.
Mm-hmm.
And so when we were building a system, we tried to build a system that accounted for as many things as were practical to account for. So if you're telling me, Town A, that crime in neighborhood A drives enforcement and that neighborhood might have more black residents in it, we can account for that now. And so the point being that we sort of take what we've deemed a preponderance of the evidence approach, which is that we're not just using one measure or one indicator that would cause sort of that turmoil between the community and law enforcement if disparities were identified, but we're using multiple measures. And then we're going to police and saying, okay, here's the deal. We've looked at your data now 7 different ways. Okay, we've accounted for all the things that we could possibly account for initially that could cause this disparity. And you still have a disparity. And so step 1 is to screen out those departments with the most significant disparities.
Ooh.
Step 2 is then to go meet with those departments and say, okay, we've identified you
That's
as
fun.
having the most significant disparities.
And
And step 3 is then to say, and now we want to look deeper at you.
oh my gosh.
And we want you to share a whole bunch of additional information with us. And we're going to spend the next 4 to 6 months looking at all aspects of your police department and producing a specific report just on your department that helps both you and the community understand what's driving your disparity and hopefully giving you some recommendations to address the disparity that's been identified.
And so how does that go over? I would imagine some towns probably genuinely don't know that they're racist.
I would beg to differ. Well, not
Okay.
racist, but the stops.
would-
So when Ken and I met in 2015,
Maybe I'm being too romantic.
No, I won't say romantic, but so as Ken said, the disparities were in the border town. So when we did New Haven, we did the first original forum in New Haven. We did it with the police chief of New Haven and the police chief of Hamden because that was the major border town that saw the disparity. And then we did Bridgeport and Stratford. and we did Hartford and Wethersfield. And I would say that Wethersfield was probably the most combative and not necessarily wanting to take accountability
Because
for
they
what
don't
the
want
data
any
showed.
black people driving through Wethersfield.
That's
or
what the
black, brown, or other.
That's what the data would apparently show. But,
Okay.
I would say outside of Wethersfield, all the other towns that, the border towns that we did the forums with the major urban centers, they were really open to at least it appeared to me, they were open to what the data was showing and the help to resolve the disparity issues. And Ken, you correct me wrong because you spent more time with them afterwards. So.
We've had different approaches from departments, right? And I'll put them in two different categories. Let's take Hamden, for example. Hamden was one of the first departments that we identified.
Well, Hamden, New Haven has a long, cantankerous, contentious border beef.
There was even a fence.
And it was evident in the data in that they were one of the first departments we identified, and we went in and we met with the department and we said, okay, we want to look a little more. And the first thing we did was we mapped all their stops in the year we were looking at. And what was as clear as day was the high level of enforcement in and around the border in New Haven.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And then
I can tell you exactly where it is.
You head south on Dixwell and
right there, Goodrich and all right there.
Yeah. And so we mapped it out and we said, okay. And we met with the department and we said, help me understand why there is so much more enforcement we broke stops down in Hamden by neighborhood. And there's one neighborhood in Hamden that has a higher black population than the rest of Hamden, and that's the portion that there's a neighborhood that borders New Haven. And then there's also a lot of stops over the border in New Haven. And so we tried to understand, why are there so many more stops here? And it's not just that you're stopping more cars in the predominantly black neighborhood or the closer you get to black and brown neighborhoods, but the type of enforcement is different. The bar is lower for stopping vehicles in those areas. So when you're patrolling the predominantly white neighborhoods, police tend to focus on safety-related issues. People blowing stop signs, talking on their cell phones, speeding, things that cause accidents or could cause harm to other people.
Mm-hmm.
Enforcement in the black and brown neighborhoods in many of these border towns is focused on low-level equipment and administrative offenses. Right, the window tint violation, the crooked license plate, the tail light.
That sounds like out of
1950s. Mm-hmm. And really, what I think we've deemed it in Connecticut is it's sort of Connecticut's version of stop and frisk, right? And so we have in Connecticut, and it's not just Connecticut. This happens all over the country. I figured out how to use our motor vehicle laws to stop, question, and frisk individuals. The frisk part maybe doesn't happen as often, right? But the same intent is there. And so the question became for the department, well, help me understand this. What's the strategy behind this? And at the time, the police chief said, well, listen, that's where we have our highest numbers of calls to 911. That's where we have our higher crime rates. And that's where we're directing our officers to use motor vehicle enforcement to get drugs and guns off the street.
Do they have a drugs and gun problem on that?
So that's the next question. Okay, is there a drug and gun problem? And not only is there the problem, but is the strategy you've implemented effective?
Well, because it doesn't make sense.
They didn't know, right? So they had this idea that you go out and you stop a lot of cars for low-level reasons.
Well, hopefully you'll get some drugs and guns.
And you ask for consent to search the car, and you search the car, and you hope you get some drugs and guns. And what the data told us is that there weren't drugs and there weren't guns. And there was at
least not in those vehicles.
In those vehicles, right? And
other vehicles,
the ones that go by.
Yeah. And there was an oversaturation of police in the area. And so, at the time, to Chief Wydra's credit, he was probably willing to be much more progressive on correcting this issue than I've seen any other chief in Connecticut.
Really?
And essentially, what he said at the time, and I think, my sense in the conversation was that. I think part of him, maybe I'm putting words in his mouth. I think part of him took the approach he took because I think in the beginning there might have been a sentiment that we're going to prove to you that if we do things your way, that crime will go up and our community will be less safe.
Mm-hmm.
And so essentially the approach he took was to tell his officers, no more. You can't make stops for any of these low-level reasons anymore. Stop stopping cars for tail lights and brake lights and administrative offenses. Focus on more
safety.
serious moving violations. Focus on public safety. He reduced the number of stops, overall number of stops that were occurring. Not significantly, but he reduced them a bit in the predominantly black neighborhood and in and around the border of New Haven. And he told his officers, stop asking everybody to search their car. If you build good probable cause, you search the vehicle, but stop asking everybody you pull over, can I search your car? Okay?
Wow.
And what he said was, let's go back and study it. Let's see how that impacts crime and how that impacts accidents and public safety. And I remember sitting in the Hamden Police Department maybe 6 months later, and we were around the table. And I remember the administration at the time was surprised. And they were surprised because they had eliminated the type of enforcement, essentially, that was driving their disparity, which meant they had all but eliminated their disparity in their data. And crime went down, and accidents went down, and actually the public was more safe. And they searched significantly fewer cars, but they were searching the right cars. And the cars that they did search when they built good probable cause, they had success with. And so they had a success rate of finding contraband us coming in of around 10%, and after they made their reforms, closer to 70%.
Wow.
Because they were
focused on different
they
things.
were focused on the right things. and the truth is that that was sort of a controversial approach. And so when we went to, for example, Wethersfield, which essentially was doing the same thing.
They said, look, this is what we did in Hamden. This is what
in
they
Hamden.
came
this
up
is what it
with.
Worked. And, all this hyperbole around, we'll be less safe if we stop that type of enforcement, and accidents, or rather crime will go up. And we were able to point to a town now and say, well, no, that's not true. Right? Crime didn't go up, and actually their crime rate went down, and they got better and their community relationships had improved.
Mm-hmm.
They weren't perfect, but they got better. And ultimately the philosophy in Wethersfield was, that's poor policing, that police were given the tools to stop cars for those low-level
so
equipment.
They wasn't even willing to entertain.
They were even willing to try
some other
for 6 months. Okay, let's.
But that's poor policing.
Mm-hmm. And the interesting thing is what we've seen is that every year since we made those changes in Hamden has fallen below the thresholds we've set. They still have work to do, particularly since Chief Wydra left.
Mm-hmm.
But Wethersfield is always, they're the only department in the state of Connecticut, because they're one of the only departments that's chosen not to make any changes.
Really?
That has shown up across every single measure we've ever used to identify disparities, in every report that we've ever done. They're the only department in the state of Connecticut.
And they revel in that title? Like, they find that good policing? They're not ashamed, or?
We have to remember, right? Police reflect the communities that they serve.
Oh, Lord.
And
to a certain degree.
To a degree, right?
Yeah.
So if the sentiment within a community is we're afraid of people over there being in the city because we don't want people from the city coming in and committing crimes in our town, that can dictate a lot of how the police respond. And when you then get support from your community, when reports come out that say, hey, you might have a race problem, when the community supports law enforcement, their current approach, as opposed to pushing the community for reform, everybody gets entrenched.
Wow.
And the political dynamics in Hamden when we were doing this work was different, right? The community, there were louder advocates around the table saying, no, you've got to do something to change. This isn't acceptable. That voice isn't there in, for example, Wethersfield.
Okay, I get that, right? I get that.
Right.
Wow. So you have this. You have this event coming up on Thursday the 9th.
Correct.
Tomorrow. An open, honest discussion about racial profiling in your community.
Mm-hmm.
That's a lot.
We decided about a year ago that the Connecticut Racial Profiling Prohibition Project was becoming a little too academic. in that we were pumping out reports and identifying departments and going in, and we were doing a lot of research trying to figure out what was driving disparities. And the message, there are two things. One is the message wasn't getting out there to the community that A, this work was happening, and B, we weren't being as well informed by the community experience as we should be.
Mm-hmm.
We being the state has an oversight advisory board that guides this work. And so this will be our, I believe, 6th community forum in the last year. We've been in Hartford, New Haven, Waterbury, New London, and we'll be in Bridgeport.
And how have they been received?
Thursday. These have been really
people fiery.
They're tough conversations to have.
Well, I could imagine.
Can I just like to say you're welcome. You guys took my blueprint.
We did.
You're more than welcome to have it, as long as it's
Earl
working in the community.
Earl started, the truth is that Earl was in the African American Affairs Commission back in 2015. They were doing that work for us. They were coordinating the community forums and ensuring that the community got involved. And unfortunately, when the state disbanded the African American Affairs Commission, there was a vacuum. And at the time, we just didn't do a great job filling it. And so it took us some time to kind of get on our feet and say, there's something missing here. And what's missing is the community. And it's important to bring together law enforcement.
I was missing.
Well, Earl was missing, but but it's important to bring together law enforcement and the community.
Well, yeah. I
mean,
listen, we sit in New Haven, which by all accounts is the architects of community policing, right? Under Nick Pasteur. We were the architects of this community policing idea, this grand experiment that if police officers could get to know the community and be seen not as an adversary, but as a partner, that somehow or other that would help curtail crime. And I think it was a lofty goal. I think on some levels it worked. But then as administrations change,
you get different focuses.
And people come with different kinds of policing strategy. And I think now we're starting to, well, at least under Mayor Hart, we were trying to come back to community policing at its roots. I don't know where the current mayor, Elliker, is going to be on this. I would imagine that he would want to see community policing back to its roots, but I don't know. So
I think it's multifaceted, not only with the community policing, but also providing awareness and knowledge to individuals in the community what their actual rights are when they're being stopped, or their knowledge about the Alvin Penn law.
I think that's a tough one because Earl, on one hand, a lot of us know what our rights are, but in the interest of trying to get home, do you know what I mean? You yield to whatever that pressure is.
I think they say knowledge is power, but take for instance the Alvin Penn law. So with the Alvin Penn law, individuals, every stop is supposed to be recorded. You're supposed to record, the police officer is supposed to record demographics, ethnicity, all of that information. At the same token, individuals, when they're stopped, are supposed to be given the opportunity to be informed that, you can report this stop via this card with this information if the stop went well for you or if the stop did not go well for you.
But if they shoot you before you get a chance to do any of that.
That's a whole different category of stop now. That's
I'm just saying, there's a whole other.
I don't think that we've been, this to, I think some policymakers sounds radical, and I don't think it is. And that is that we've learned a few things over the last few years. That is that when law enforcement used the motor vehicle laws to focus on roadway safety, so they focus on those violations that cause accidents, there are virtually no racial disparities in the data. When they start to use the motor vehicle laws as a quote-unquote crime reduction tool, or to do other things that they weren't necessarily intended for, we start to see significant disparities. And so to some degree, we need to go back to the legislature and say, here's the deal. You gave law enforcement these tools. They are technically using the tools you gave them. Technically, law enforcement have the right to stop somebody for what's called a display of plate violation. Right now, this is the most classic one to use. So the legislature passed a law. I don't know how long the law's been on the books, but essentially, it was during a time when those tinted screens were becoming very popular to put over your plate. I don't know if you've
Oh.
ever seen them, right?
Yeah.
I'm not a car.
And
Yes,
so,
I think
and
I do
so
know what you.
the
yes.
legislature. Well, you can't block your plate, right?
Right.
Police have to be able to see your plate, and you can't cover it with a piece of paper or with something. And so they passed a law that is essentially an obstruction of plate law. Well, the way the law is literally written, it allows law enforcement to stop cars who obstruct any part of the plate. And so the vast majority of those stops are made of vehicles that have usually like the border around the plate. It advertises maybe where they bought the car, the college they went to, or the school they go to. And the obstruction is that oftentimes those sort of border vanity things, they block maybe part of the word Connecticut. Now, I'm sorry. If you're a law enforcement officer in the state of Connecticut, it's a Connecticut plate.
Well, it's blue.
It's blue. You can still see most of the word, because of the literal interpretation of the law enforcement use that as a pretext, right? They do that, not because they care that part of the word Connecticut is cut off, because they want to stop you for some other reason. They want to question you. They want to search the vehicle, and so I think the legislature needs to take a hard look at the current motor vehicle statutes that are on the books, and they need to figure out a way to, because we know how law enforcement apply them, we know that they're not applied fairly, and so I'm not convinced that we can expect law enforcement to just stop using that, because there's a belief in their minds that it's a useful tool. There's lots of anecdotal stories about how it's useful, but the data would tell us it's not all that useful. And so the legislature needs to likely rein that in. And they can do it in one of a few ways. One is they can remove some of those laws from the books and make sure that motor vehicle stops are only focused on motor vehicle safety. Or they can do what I've been advocating, which is great primary and secondary statutes, which is you can only stop cars for these primary reasons. And those primary reasons need to be something that is a serious safety violation, a moving violation, something that causes accidents, and everything else is secondary. So if you stop a car because it was doing, 60 and a 25, and it turns out that their vehicle wasn't registered, you can address that. But you can't stop the vehicle just because it was unregistered, right, as an example. And lots of states have these primary, secondary laws. And what that does is it really allows the legislature to step in and reauthorize what their intent is, which is that motor vehicle enforcement be used for motor vehicle safety. And all of these other violations that are being used as pretextual reasons to stop cars as part of a crime reduction strategy, they can rein that in. And they also really need to, I think, go the way of Rhode Island, which is in 2015, Rhode Island passed a law that said police can no longer do consent searches of vehicles. And, that seems like a crazy idea here in Connecticut. Truth is, black and brown drivers are 3 times more likely to be asked for consent to search their vehicle. Consent searches historically yield very little contraband. And so we know it's not an effective tool. And we know that it's being used significantly more when black and brown drivers are being stopped. And to both of the points you were making before, we can do all the education we want to let folks know that they can refuse a consent search, right? You can say no, but the lived experience is that most people are afraid to say no. They just want to get through that experience alive
because they have guns.
Right. So it doesn't it doesn't matter how educated people are that they have the right to refuse a consent search, because there's a power dynamic.
Yeah.
And so if we know that, again, the tool isn't all that effective, we should curb the use of the tool, because police will use the tools they're given. And at some point, we have to look to the people that gave them the tools and said, hey, you're part of the problem here. You gave them the tools, it's being misused, and you've got to weigh the unintended consequence of what it is that you've given them. And that might seem aggressive or radical to some, but I think it's the only true answer to resolving having a more immediate impact on racial disparities in traffic stops. And, I'm not, maybe I'm a little cynical in having done this work for about 10 years now. The truth is that, what it will likely do is it will show weak points in other parts of the system, because police will find other ways to accomplish what they feel they need to accomplish. And so other things will pop to the top as potentially being misused that needs to be addressed.
But that's a good
But
thing.
we don't know that yet. So
Okay.
I will say just for 2 quick points. So like you talked about a little bit before, one of the reasons that we're here, we have the program tomorrow. It's taking place in Bridgeport, 5:30 p.m. To 8 p.m. at 999 Broad Street at the
Margaret Morton Government Center.
So Ken had, because we still operate in, similar circles, and I ran into Ken. He's like, he was looking at the reports, and he's like, Bridgeport's on the report. And I said, well, thank you for letting me know so we could be proactive. And that's when he connected me with the person that's helping put on the forums throughout the state, a lady by the name of Anna Mitchell, who's awesome and dynamic, and brought it to the city's attention that, this is something that needs to be focused on so that resolutions can be brought to the community and to the police department. So it's one of the reasons we're having this open, honest conversation with the police chief in Bridgeport.
So what is the climate like in Bridgeport with their police department?
I'm still getting to know it because I'm just fairly new there. But they seem to want to.
Because they've had a lot of challenges, and
I've heard, and I don't know the police chief that well. I'm getting to know them as well as other people.
Because they've gone through a bunch of chiefs too, right?
Right. So it's different.
They're also part of the issue in Bridgeport, which is an issue that a lot of the cities face, but it seems to have plagued Bridgeport more so than it did New Haven and Hartford, and that is a resource issue in that Bridgeport is one of the only communities. It actually is the only community in Connecticut that was not able to collect the basic information that was required by law starting in 2013.
Why?
On every single traffic stop until midway through 2018.
Why?
Because the truth is that
they didn't have any money.
They didn't have the resources to have the technology available and the records management system available to do that, and so they were using a paper system. And
what do you mean, like having little people out there at the stop signs?
Every time the cop pulled over somebody, they had a little paper form, and they had to fill it out on paper instead of in the computer in the car, and then it would end up. And so then you have all this paper
that could end up anywhere,
and they go to records clerks, who then have to enter it into the computer. So now you've added another step. You've added additional resources to have to get this data to the state. And the truth is, there was no oversight. So if I made 10 stops as an officer, I might hand in 2 forms because nobody was checking, and because in their mind it was a pain to fill out, and it wasn't automated, and so they've struggled. We've tried to be as understanding as possible in understanding the resource issue that the department faces, but we as the entity within the state that has been overseeing this, we've been fairly frustrated in that unfortunately we're understanding of the problems Bridgeport faced resource-wise, but there are a number of other departments in the state that also dealt with similar problems in that they didn't have an automated system to collect data, and so they were using paper, but they figured it out. New London is a perfect example, also resource-starved, and to this day still collects traffic stop data on paper, and they process 10,000 stops a year on paper, and they do it well.
Oh, okay.
And there's so there are examples of departments that
might be
their best practices,
because the truth is they've prioritized.
That's what I mean. They might feel
important.
like this is important.
And in Bridgeport, the attitude seems
not
to have
so
been,
much.
it wasn't that important, and so until somebody comes and bugs me about it, I'll deal with it, and so that's been frustrating.
I think with this particular instance and the report happening and the community forum taking place, that we'll definitely see some proactivity and resolution and looking at best practices, so that there's more of a concerted effort between the police department and the city and the community.
So now, do you have the police department show up to these meetings? Like,
yes.
Do they come?
The
like,
police chief
like the
will
chief?
be there tomorrow.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, and some of his leadership, some of his cabinet, they
Absolutely.
come. And so, are they in the presence of mind to hear what community has to say?
Absolutely.
Okay. They're not going to try to refute what the community is saying, are they?
I mean, it's kind
we're
of
going to
hard
find out.
Yeah, well, we'll see, but it's kind of hard to refute the data. As Ken stated, it's a little antiquated in the system, so definitely looking for recommendations and best practices to improve what's going on so that the data can be communicated effectively to the IMRP, and we can resolve the issue and get rid of the disparities or find out what the actual disparities are once the data is being transmitted and communicated properly.
Okay. And so, so when you've seen these community meetings play out around the state, have they helped with your data? Has it helped support whatever it is you're trying to, like, how do you overlay that with what you find out?
What the community conversations, I think, what they've primarily done over the course of the last year is they have helped to better inform the direction in which we're going in.
Okay.
So, the data piece of it is, right, it's fairly academic, and part of the goal of these forums is just let folks know, like, this is what we do, and this is how we do it, and this is why it's important. But the most beneficial part of these forums has been listening to folks, and there's usually a lot of people that show up that say, we're glad this is happening, but this is what happened to me. This is what happened to my son or my daughter.
Mm-hmm.
This is how I felt when I interacted in this community. And we've tried to take that. We have videotaped, and it's on our project website. We have recorded all of the forums that we've conducted over the last year, so that advisory board members who haven't been able to attend can watch them. And we've created highlight reels, and it is informing where we go as a state, and it's informing the types of policy proposals. We're trying to look at this at the end of the day. What can we do to eliminate racial disparities from the seat in which we sit in, which is I sit in an academic seat, right? So from my perch, it's how can I use data to help inform the community and law enforcement about what's going on so they can make changes, and how can I help them craft those changes? And then I think from the state's advisory board perspective, it's what policies can we be recommending to the legislature so that they can have some tools to address these disparities. And I think some of the solutions lie in being able to go back to the legislature and say, we've heard from your constituents throughout the state. This is not a yesterday problem. It's still a today problem. And here are the stories that we've heard. So even though we've done all this great work and we have addressed racial disparities in these ways, we haven't gone far enough, and here's the role you can play. And so I'm hoping to use the stories and the experiences from these forums to bring legislators along to some of the policy proposals that I think are on the table, which include, right, eliminating the use of consent searches in motor vehicle stops, creating a system for primary and secondary stops so that certain violations that are only being used for Black and brown communities aren't anymore. And I think we have to have a serious conversation with the state. We made, as a state, police tax collectors and paperwork checkers, right, in terms of ensuring you've got registration and you've paid your property tax bill at home can affect whether you can re-register your car, right, or your tax bill for your car can affect. And so police now are playing the role of tax collector.
Wow.
And they're towing cars, and they have the authority to stop you if your registration isn't done. And so do we want police to be playing that role? Is that the role for them?
And I never thought about that. You just think that that's all part of the natural policing, but it isn't.
And why does it have to be that way? Right. And if we know that, so here's a good example. We had a community, Waterbury, a number of years ago, we had identified, and we went into the Waterbury Police Department. We said, oh, you're stopping an awful lot of particularly Hispanic drivers for unregistered vehicles in this particular neighborhood. Can you help me understand why that is? That's what's driving your disparity. And they said, well, that's very easy. That's nothing to do with race. This is a socioeconomic thing, right? Poor equals, unable to pay for registration. That was the line. They said, well, do you know if that's true? Have you run plates in other parts of the city to know if the people in that neighborhood are more likely to be driving unregistered vehicles, which could justify, you're running plates at a higher rate in that?
Wow.
Or have you just created a self-fulfilling prophecy? Have you told your guys, go out and find unregistered vehicles? They go to the poor neighborhood, they run plates in the poor neighborhood, they find unregistered vehicles, and then they come back and say, well, see, it's a poor problem. And so we actually ran an experiment. We said, well, we want you to expose, and we identify different neighborhoods in the city, these neighborhoods, which are more predominantly white, to the same type of enforcement that you did the predominantly Hispanic neighborhood. And then we're going to see what the rate of registration violations are. And would you believe that white drivers were 7% more likely when they had their plates run to be driving an unregistered vehicle than black or Hispanic drivers.
Oh my
They
God!
were never being stopped.
And so, right, there's this.
Yeah, they were never stopped.
And they were never being stopped because police just assumed that, right? Well, of course, their paperwork's in order. And we don't have to run their plates. And we don't run LPR readers, which are automated license plate readers in the predominantly white neighborhoods, because we don't. And so,
That's a hell of an assumption.
Yeah. And for them, it just seems so logical. It was, well, this is socioeconomic. It's not race-driven. Well, but yeah, but can you prove that? And the truth is, there is only one violation that we have found data to support a socioeconomic argument, which is poor people have a harder time maintaining proper insurance.
Okay.
That's and think about that, right?
I can attest to that.
But insurance is paid every month,
yes.
right? And so if there's going to be an economic hardship, it's going to be on a bill that's paid every month, not every 2 or 3 years.
Yeah.
And so the idea that registration, costs a fee, and therefore, poor people are going to be less likely to afford that. The truth is, there's no data to support that. The same is true for equipment violations. I hear it all the time. Well, black and brown drivers, because of their socioeconomic status, are more likely to drive around with equipment violations, a taillight, a headlight out. And so that's the police say, well, that's not our fault. But do you know if that's true? That's all anecdotal. And all of the statistical evidence tells us that no, if you expose white drivers to the same type of enforcement, meaning if you look for those violations where white drivers drive, you find them at the same or a higher rate.
Wow.
And so we've got to do away with this, way of thinking, which is that this somehow isn't related to race. It's related to socioeconomic status. No, it's related to race.
Mm-hmm. Code switching.
Yeah.
So just 2 points.
2 points because we got to
go. So I think Kim makes an excellent point. He tells this story, and I forget which town, but I recall hearing about it when you talked about them stopping people because of drunk driving. And then later on, come to find out after all the statistical analysis.
It was a department that had stopped 1,608 drivers for low-level lighting violation, headlight, a tail light. To put that in context, it was a fairly small community, and they had stopped in the same 12-month period only 740 speeders. Okay, so they stopped twice as many people for a low-level equipment violation than they did for speeding. And the department had said to us, they said, it's part of our roving DUI patrol. We send our officers out there. We tell them, stop cars for any low-level reason you can think of. And where are you coming from? Where are you going to? Have you had a drink tonight? If they seem, sober, you say, well, just so you know, your headlight's out, your taillight's out, your brake light's out. You should get that fixed and have a nice day. And that was predominantly being used in the black and brown areas of town. And so the question became, okay, well, are you finding drunks? Because if you're finding drunks, then at least as a department, you can go back and say, well, we know that this is causing a disparity, but look at how many drunks we got off the street. And the truth of the matter is they didn't know. And when we went back and looked at a 1,608 driver stopped for a low-level lighting violation, they only found one drunk driver.
Oh, man.
Now, out of the 740 speeders, they found 15 drunk drivers. So just by the sheer numbers, if you stopped twice as many speeders, you would have found 30 drunk drivers.
Yes.
And again, it's part of it is just the way of thinking, the way that law enforcement have been sort of trained to think. Some of this is, and what we're still seeing in 2020 now is still just the old vestiges of the war on drugs, and that mentality, the war on poverty.
Oh, you guys have to come back. We have to do more of this conversation. Yeah, find another date.
Just to leave you with this note, so they're a similar bill, similar to Alvin Penn law. SB 880 was passed in the legislature last year, which hopefully will gain some traction and teeth, and we'll get the same kind of data analysis. And it's in regards to prosecutorial transparency.
Oh.
So we're going to see how many deals are made and why are people sentencing or people getting their sentences sentenced as such by the prosecutors, such they have such leeway. So I'm looking forward to that.
I want to hear about this. You got to come back and talk about that.
Absolutely.
That's all. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Tomorrow evening at 5:30 to 8 o'clock, an open, honest discussion about racial profiling in your community in Bridgeport at the Margaret Morton Government Center 999 Broad Street in Bridgeport.
Correct. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.